A tomb beneath one of the most photographed monuments on Earth sat completely undisturbed for 2,000 years. Millions of tourists walked right over it. Then, a team running a routine flood survey, not even looking for a burial, pointed radar equipment straight at the ground. The readings did not match anything they expected to see. The city that vanished for 1,000 years, Petra, sits carved into the pink sandstone cliffs of a desert canyon in southern Jordan. Built by the Nabateans, a nomadic Arab people who settled the region beginning around the 4th century BC. Rather than relying on agriculture or conquest the way many neighboring civilizations did, the Nabateans built their wealth almost entirely around controlling the incense trade, transporting frankincense, myrrh, spices, and silk from southern Arabia and beyond, toward markets across Egypt, Syria, and the wider Mediterranean world. Their capital, accessible only through a narrow, 1-kilometer canyon entrance called the Siq, gave them a naturally defensible position from which to tax, guide, and provision the caravans passing through their territory, and by the 1st century AD, the city may have held somewhere between 20 and 30,000 residents at its peak. None of that population could have survived in such an arid environment without genuinely remarkable engineering. The Nabateans built an intricate network of dams across the wadi beds surrounding Petra, specifically to capture seasonal flash floods, along with terracotta pipelines capable of moving water across kilometers of terrain, and hundreds of rock-cut cisterns designed to store whatever rain fell across the surrounding basin. Some of that original waterproofing plaster, a simple mixture of lime and sand, has survived intact inside certain cisterns for roughly 2,000 years, a small but genuinely striking testament to how carefully this system was originally built. That secure water supply is precisely what allowed the Nabateans to shift their attention toward the elaborate architecture that eventually made the city famous, and carving those facades directly into solid rock, according to some historians, carried a deliberate symbolic meaning of its own, a declaration from a formerly nomadic people that they had permanently settled and intended to stay. That wealth and strategic position could not protect the city forever. In 106 AD, the Roman Emperor Trajan formally annexed the Nabatean kingdom without significant military resistance, reorganizing it into the province of Arabia Petraea. Petra initially retained real importance even under Roman rule, briefly earning the title Metropolis of Arabia, and continued benefiting from new infrastructure, including a colonnaded main street. Over the following centuries, though, long-distance trade gradually shifted away from overland caravan routes toward maritime shipping lanes through the Red Sea, steadily eroding the city's commercial importance. A devastating earthquake in 363 AD destroyed much of Petra's infrastructure, including significant parts of its sophisticated water management system, and a further major earthquake in 551 AD compounded that damage further. By the 7th and 8th centuries, sustained habitation at the site had largely ceased, and Petra faded into obscurity, remembered only by local Bedouin communities who continued using some of its carved caves for shelter. For well over 1,000 years, the wider Western world had no confirmed knowledge that Petra still existed at all. That changed on August 22, 1812, when Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, traveling through the region under the disguise of a Muslim pilgrim named Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah, convinced local guides to lead him to a legendary ruin rumored to house the tomb of the prophet Aaron. Burckhardt spent roughly a single day exploring the site before becoming convinced he had rediscovered the genuine, long-lost city of Petra, and his published accounts, appearing in print after his death, ignited a wave of European scholarly and popular fascination with the site that has never fully faded since. Petra earned UNESCO World Heritage status in 1985 and was named one of the new 7 Wonders of the World in 2007, cementing its modern reputation well before Steven Spielberg further amplified that fame by using its most iconic structure as a filming location in 1989. That structure, the Treasury, sits at the very heart of this long, layered history, and understanding exactly why archaeologists remained so genuinely uncertain about its true purpose for so long requires looking directly at the specific Nabatean ruler most researchers now believe the building was actually built for. The king whose name keeps coming up, among all the rulers who governed the Nabatean kingdom across its several centuries of independence, one name comes up more consistently than any other in connection with Petra's most impressive architecture, Aretas Thor Philopatris, sometimes recorded as Philodemos, who reigned from roughly 9 BC to 40 AD. His reign is widely regarded by historians as the genuine high point of Nabatean power, a period when the kingdom's population, trade network, and architectural ambitions all reached their peaks simultaneously. Aretus IV appears not only on coins minted and circulated throughout the wider region during his reign, but also receives a direct mention in the New Testament in the second letter to the Corinthians, which references a governor answering to Aretus guarding the city of Damascus, a detail historians point to as evidence of just how far Nabatean political influence genuinely extended northward during this specific period. Under Aretus IV's rule, Petra's urban core reportedly included a rock-cut theater capable of seating 3,000 to 4,000 spectators, a colonnaded main street, temples, markets, and public baths, alongside suburbs extending well beyond the main valley itself. Most researchers studying the treasury specifically now believe the building was constructed at the very beginning of the 1st century AD, precisely during this same reign, intended to serve as a mausoleum and crypt for Aretus IV himself. The treasury's carved facade itself, measuring roughly 25 meters wide and nearly 39 meters tall, reflects the strongest possible Hellenistic influence found anywhere at Petra, drawing directly from the architectural style of Alexandria, then the greatest city in the entire eastern Mediterranean, complete with a broken pediment, ornate Corinthian columns, and a small circular structure called a tholos, positioned at the very top of the facade, believed to depict the goddess Isis Tyche, a blended figure combining the Egyptian goddess Isis with Tyche, the Greek goddess of fortune. That theory, compelling as it already was, based purely on architectural style and rough dating estimates, had never actually been confirmed through direct physical evidence recovered from inside the structure, since virtually every other tomb excavated anywhere at Petra had already turned up empty or badly disturbed by the time modern archaeologists arrived to study them properly. Why dating these tombs has always been so difficult, part of what makes the 2024 discovery genuinely significant, becomes clear once you understand just how difficult dating Petra's tombs has traditionally been for archaeologists working at the site. Unlike many ancient burial sites elsewhere in the world, Petra's roughly 600 rock-cut tomb facades almost never include the kind of directly datable evidence, coins, pottery, or clear inscriptions, that researchers normally rely on to pin down a precise construction date. Only a small number of tombs anywhere in Petra carry surviving inscriptions naming their owners or a specific date, in sharp contrast to a related Nabatean site called Hegra in modern-day Saudi Arabia, where researchers have identified 31 separately dated tombs using exactly this kind of inscribed evidence. Because of that gap, historians studying Petra have generally had to rely on comparing architectural style and decorative complexity between different tombs, and even that approach carries real limits, since researchers have found that competing decorative styles clearly coexisted side by side rather than following any neat, reliable chronological sequence. Scholars generally agree the most elaborate tombs, including the treasury itself, were most likely constructed sometime between the 2nd century BC and the early 2nd century AD, when the Nabatean kingdom was at its wealthiest, but pinning down anything more precise than that broad window has remained genuinely difficult for well over a century of serious archaeological study. That specific, persistent gap, a stunning monument with no reliable, physically confirmed construction date, is exactly what made Tim Kinnaird's 2024 sediment analysis so valuable, since it offered researchers their first genuine opportunity to date the treasury using real, physical, scientifically testable material recovered directly from underneath it, rather than continuing to rely purely on stylistic comparison alone. That persistent, frustrating gap, a strong architectural theory with no matching physical confirmation, sat unresolved for generations, until one earlier excavation finally gave researchers their first genuine physical foothold. The first tombs found in 2003. In 2003, an earlier excavation team working on the treasury's left flank uncovered several tombs cut directly into the ground beneath the monument. That earlier dig, however, produced only partial skeletal remains, and the project itself eventually stalled once it ran into funding shortages and the lengthy approval process required to dig at one of Jordan's most closely protected archaeological sites. Piers Paul Kriesman, who took part in that original 2003 discovery and went on to become executive director of the American Center of Research, spent the following 2 decades believing that matching burial chambers likely sat on the opposite, right side of the treasury as well, buried beneath the same compacted earth that had concealed the first set of tombs for centuries. Confirming that theory, however, required both fresh technology and formal permission from Jordanian authorities, neither of which Kriesman's team had access to until an entirely separate research project gave them exactly the opening they needed. The radar survey that wasn't even looking for tombs. In early 2024, a team led by Professor Richard Bates, a geophysicist at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, received permission from Jordanian authorities to conduct a scan in and around the treasury for a purpose that had nothing to do with hunting for hidden burials at all. Bates explained the project's actual goal directly, stating that the main purpose of the survey was to assess the condition of the areas around the treasury, its courtyard, the plaza, the exit of the sick, and the wadi feeding into all of them, specifically to plan future flood mitigation work capable of better controlling water damage at the site. To conduct that assessment, Bates's team used two separate non-invasive remote sensing techniques, electromagnetic conductivity and ground-penetrating radar, both capable of detecting underground structures without disturbing a single grain of soil on the surface. Bates himself described the team's underlying hope directly, saying there had always been a general thought that additional tombs might exist beyond the ones already confirmed, but that none had ever actually been located still containing genuine burials, and that the team's specific hope going into this survey was to finally find one still fully intact. Kriesman's team specifically wanted to test whether the physical readings on the right side of the treasury matched the same underground features already confirmed on the left side back in 2003. And the scan results came back showing strong similarities between both sides, giving the researchers exactly the evidence they needed to formally request permission to excavate. That single week of careful, non-destructive scanning accomplished something 2 decades of speculation alone never could, turning Kriesman's long-standing personal theory into a testable, radar-confirmed target specific enough that Jordanian authorities finally approved a real excavation. The kind of quiet turning point worth hitting subscribe for if you want to see exactly where it led, because what the team actually found once they started digging turned out to be something archaeologists at Petra had never managed to recover intact before. Why they dug sideways instead of down. Once the radar survey confirmed a likely void sitting beneath the treasury's right side, the excavation team faced an immediate, genuinely important decision about exactly how to physically reach it. Digging straight down toward the detected void would have meant cutting directly through solid rock, risking real permanent damage to part of one of the most historically significant and heavily protected buildings on the planet. Bates described the team's actual approach directly, explaining that instead of drilling downward, the excavators dug carefully from the outside toward the void, working by hand rather than with heavy machinery, specifically to avoid damaging any part of the surrounding structure. That same kind of patient, careful, non-destructive method, prioritizing the monument's preservation over simple speed, reflects a broader pattern common across modern archaeological work at genuinely irreplaceable sites, where researchers consistently choose slower, safer techniques over anything that risks permanently harming the very thing they are trying to study. That careful digging eventually paid off in August 2024, when the team, joined by a film crew for the Discovery Channel program Expedition Unknown, finally broke through into the actual burial chamber the radar had detected months earlier. What was actually inside? Inside the newly opened chamber, the team discovered 12 complete human skeletons, including men, women, and children, resting in their original ancient positions, undisturbed for roughly 2,000 years, alongside a substantial collection of grave goods made from bronze, iron, and ceramic. One particular skeleton was found still clutching a ceramic vessel shaped remarkably like a chalice, a detail that drew immediate comparisons among the excavation team and media coverage alike to the fictional Holy Grail featured in the very same monument's Hollywood film appearance decades earlier. Tim Kinnaird, a research officer at the University of St. Andrews' School of Earth and Environmental Sciences, conducted sediment analysis specifically aimed at dating the tomb, and his findings suggested the chamber was constructed sometime between the mid-1st century BC and the early 2nd century AD. Kinnaird described the significance of finally having reliable physical dating evidence directly, saying it was fantastic to finally have pottery, ecofacts, and sediment data capable of dating exactly when the treasury itself was actually built, rather than continuing to rely on assumptions and educated guesses the way researchers largely had for decades beforehand. Kinnaird added separately that few remains had ever previously been found in Petra's tombs, specifically because of how thoroughly those spaces had been reused and repurposed by different occupants across the roughly 2,000 years since their original construction, making this specific chamber's undisturbed condition all the more valuable scientifically. That specific combination, complete undisturbed skeletons paired with genuine, physically testable dating evidence, gave the discovery a level of scientific value considerably beyond simple novelty, and it stood in sharp, immediate contrast to nearly everything else archaeologists had previously managed to find inside Petra's countless other tombs. Why this tomb was different from every other tomb in Petra Bates explained directly just how unusual this specific discovery actually was, compared to Petra's broader archaeological record, stating that if you look at all the other tombs across the wider Petra area, only a small handful have ever contained any human remains at all, and those remains that do exist have generally been extremely fragmentary rather than complete. Centuries of grave robbing, repeated flash flooding through the surrounding canyon, and reuse of empty tomb spaces by later nomadic groups seeking shelter had, between them, stripped the overwhelming majority of Petra's tombs completely clean long before modern archaeologists ever arrived to study them. Josh Gates, the Expedition Unknown host who took part directly in the 2024 excavation, described the team's reaction to finding this specific tomb fully intact, saying they were absolutely stunned by the discovery, and that since nearly every other tomb at Petra had already been found empty, this particular chamber represented perhaps the single most significant tomb ever recovered at the entire site. Kriesman echoed that same basic point separately, noting that people walking past the treasury every single day tend to assume they already know and understand the site, recognizing the famous facade without ever realizing just how much additional history still sits buried directly beneath their own feet. That rarity, 12 complete skeletons recovered from a site where genuine, undisturbed human remains had almost never turned up before, immediately raised an obvious follow-up question about exactly who these specific 12 people actually were, and why they might have been buried in such a genuinely significant location in the first place. What the Nabateans believed about death. Understanding why the Nabateans built such elaborate, permanent tombs in the first place requires understanding at least the basic outline of their religious beliefs, even though direct written records describing those beliefs in detail remain relatively scarce. The Nabateans worshipped a pantheon of deities, with a god named Dushara recognized as the supreme figure within that broader religious system, and inscriptions along with rock-cut shrines scattered throughout Petra reflect a set of religious practices that blended older Arabian traditions with influences absorbed from the surrounding Greco-Roman world over time. That religious framework, treating burial and the physical preservation of the body as a matter of real spiritual importance, likely helps explain why Nabatean elites invested such enormous effort into carving permanent, monumental tomb facades directly into solid rock, often working from the top of the cliff face downward, using wedges and platforms to separate and shape each block, rather than opting for simpler, more temporary burial methods. Researchers studying tomb ownership inscriptions found elsewhere at Petra have also suggested that women may have held meaningful economic roles within Nabatean society, sometimes holding direct ownership over specific tomb structures, though the exact scope and nature of that status remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate given how limited the surviving written record actually is. That same limited written record is precisely why physical discoveries like the 12 skeletons found in 2024 carry so much added scientific weight, since actual human remains and grave goods can sometimes reveal details about daily life, health, and social structure that inscriptions alone were never going to fully capture. Who these people might have been, researchers studying the newly uncovered remains have proposed that the treasury itself likely functioned as a mausoleum and crypt built at the beginning of the 1st century AD, specifically for King Aretas IV, the same ruler whose reign marked the genuine height of Nabatean wealth and architectural ambition described earlier. Under Aretas IV's reign, a kingdom that had begun as a community of goat and sheep herders grew substantially into a considerably wealthier civilization of merchants, a transformation reflected directly in the increasingly lavish, elaborate construction projects undertaken across Petra during this same general period. Whether the 12 individuals found inside this specific newly discovered chamber were personally connected to Aretas IV himself, to his extended royal family, or to other high-status Nabatean officials remains a genuine open question researchers are still actively working through. What Bates and his colleagues have confirmed clearly is that analyzing the skeletal material directly, including the teeth and bones themselves, should eventually let researchers determine real, concrete details about these specific individuals' overall health, typical diet, and likely social standing within Nabatean society. Information that could meaningfully expand what historians currently understand about how ordinary birth, death, and burial rituals actually worked within this specific ancient culture. Bates noted directly that this kind of skeletal analysis can reveal genuine insight into the rituals surrounding both birth and death within Nabatean life, precisely the kind of intimate social detail that inscriptions and architecture alone were never capable of fully providing on their own. That broader research goal, using 12 individual skeletons to help answer much larger questions about an entire vanished civilization, reflects exactly why researchers describe this discovery as carrying genuine international significance, rather than simply representing an interesting one-time curiosity. The television crew who got to film at once Bates's radar survey and Kriesman's follow-up excavation planning made a genuine discovery increasingly likely. Kriesman made a specific decision to bring outside media directly into the process, contacting Josh Gates, host of the Discovery Channel series Expedition Unknown, ahead of the actual August 2024 excavation. Kriesman later described that specific phone call directly, recalling that he told Gates simply that he thought the team had found something significant worth documenting properly on camera. With a full film crew present throughout the dig itself, the eventual excavation and its results were later broadcast as a two-part episode marking the season premiere of Expedition Unknown, giving a global television audience a rare, direct look at professional archaeological fieldwork unfolding in close to real time, rather than only reading about a finished discovery well after the fact. That kind of direct documentation matters for public understanding of archaeology generally, since it lets ordinary viewers see firsthand exactly how patient, careful, and methodologically cautious a genuine excavation actually looks in practice, a considerably slower and more deliberate process than dramatized fictional versions of similar discoveries tend to suggest. That same televised excavation also helped draw renewed public attention to a broader, still unresolved reality about Petra as a whole, the genuinely enormous amount of the ancient city that nobody has ever properly excavated at all. What scientists still don't know. Despite roughly 2 centuries of dedicated archaeological study at Petra, researchers estimate that as much as 85% of the ancient city's buildings and monuments may still remain buried and completely unexcavated, according to some scientific estimates cited following the 2024 discovery, while other researchers place the current explored proportion of the wider site at closer to just 15% overall. Whichever specific figure ultimately proves most accurate, both estimates point toward the same basic conclusion, that even after generations of serious scholarly attention, the overwhelming majority of Petra's physical history remains genuinely unknown and unexamined. Petra itself contains more than 600 individually carved stone facades according to surveys of the wider site, meaning even the 12 skeleton tomb discovered in 2024 represents only a single confirmed data point among hundreds of comparable structures still scattered across the surrounding canyon. Kriesman himself has said directly that there remains so much left to learn even about the treasury specifically, including exactly when the structure was actually built and precisely why. Questions that this newest tomb discovery may help answer in far greater physical detail than researchers had access to previously. Belgian archaeologist Laurent Tholbeck, a professor at the Free University of Brussels who has separately studied the treasury's construction timeline, has proposed the building's original construction date falls within the first quarter of the 1st century AD. A specific proposal, the newly recovered tomb's own sediment-based dating evidence, may eventually help formally confirm or revise. That same honest, openly acknowledged uncertainty, genuine, historically significant discovery, paired with an enormous, still unexplored remainder of an entire ancient city, is exactly the kind of realistic, unfinished picture that continues drawing serious archaeological teams back to Petra decade after decade, using careful, non-invasive scanning technology and patient hand excavation rather than any dramatic shortcut. Verdict here is where things actually stand. Petra rose to prominence as the Nabatean capital sometime around the 4th century BC, built on wealth generated through control of the ancient incense trade, and sustained by a remarkably sophisticated water system of dams, cisterns, and pipelines. Reaching its architectural and political peak under King Aretas IV between roughly 9 BC and 40 AD, before Roman annexation in 16 AD, and a series of devastating earthquakes eventually led to the city's gradual abandonment and disappearance from Western knowledge until Johann Ludwig Burckhardt's disguised 1812 rediscovery. In 2003, an excavation team working on the left side of Petra's treasury uncovered tombs containing only partial skeletal remains, leading researcher Piers Paul Kreisman to suspect matching chambers likely sat undiscovered on the building's opposite side. In early 2024, a University of St. Andrews team led by geophysicist Richard Bates ran a ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic conductivity survey originally intended purely to assess flood risk around the treasury, and the results revealed strong similarities between the right side of the structure and the previously confirmed left side tombs, giving Kreisman's team the evidence needed to secure formal excavation permission from Jordanian authorities. Digging carefully from the outside inward specifically to avoid damaging the monument, the team broke through in August 2024 to reveal a fully sealed tomb containing 12 complete human skeletons, along with bronze, iron, and ceramic grave goods, including one skeleton still holding a chalice-shaped vessel that drew immediate comparisons to the fictional Holy Grail from the site's own Hollywood film appearance. Sediment analysis conducted by researcher Tim Kinnaird dated the chamber to sometime between the mid-1st century BC and early 2nd century AD, finally giving researchers physical dating evidence for a monument long dated only by architectural style, and researchers have proposed the treasury itself may have served as a mausoleum built for the Nabatean king Aretas IV. The discovery, filmed for a 2-part episode of Discovery Channel's Expedition Unknown, represents one of the only intact, complete burial chambers ever recovered anywhere at Petra, a site where the overwhelming majority of tombs have historically been found empty or badly disturbed, and where researchers estimate as much as 85% of the ancient city may still remain completely unexcavated. None of what that team uncovered required anything beyond patient, careful, properly permitted archaeological work, built on 2 decades of one researcher's educated hunch, finally confirmed by radar, and physically reached by hand rather than force. A tomb sealed for 2,000 years, sitting directly beneath one of the most photographed buildings on the planet, waited exactly that long for someone to finally check. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.